This is a demonstration of how the historical figures' heads are made, and we're going to go through it step by step. And the first step is to make the skull. This is the kind of skull we're going to produce, a simulated bone skull. But the first thing we have to make is the armature. You can see it sticking out the bottom. This fastens the skull to the body and supports the inside of the skull. This is the kind of wire we make the armature out of. It's galvanized iron wire, and it's 7 inches exactly. Now this 7 inches is because that works for the scale of the heads for the historical figures, which are quarter life size. 7 inches. And we're going to take the wire and bend it around this mandrel so we get a round crown to it. And then we're going to pinch it together at the bottom so it has 2 little loops at the bottom to keep the neck narrow and together so it doesn't split out of the plaster. Neck part's a little straighter. Come up here and crimp down. There's 2 sections. Now we need to braze this connection here so that it will stay rigid, won't wiggle around. This is the flux we're putting on. It's the metal so the flux melts, turns to glass, which is what essentially it's doing. And fuses, there it is, it's all done. We've quenched it, now it will be cool, we can handle it, and there it is, that's the finished armature. This is a setup to pour the skull of plaster. Now here is a silicone mold. I don't make my own silicone molds, but the molds are made from my skull. They are set in a plaster jacket, 2-piece mold. Each has a plaster jacket, and they come together this way. But before we do that, we're going to set our armature into the mold, and I'll tell you a little secret about that in a moment. Now we close the mold, and the mold is held together with a rubber band. Now in order to keep the armature from falling all the way down to the bottom of the mold and resting on its top, we have this little alligator clip right at the tip of the armature on both sides to hold it in place. So when we pour the plaster in, the armature will stay upright and not sink to the bottom. But before that we have to mix the plaster and pour it in the mold. The plaster we use, it's called Velmix. It's a Kerr product. It's very hard dental plaster. It's called a stone or a casting plaster. So this is the bowl into which we will mix the plaster and water, and we pour just a couple of tablespoonfuls of water into it. I've made a mark in the bowl. It's always the same because the same amount of plaster is poured into the mold. And then we begin ladling our Velmix into the water. We put this in the water and let it sit until it saturates the little mountain that's been created. We're not stirring it around. Martha Armstrong Hand, a master ceramicist and mold maker, taught me something about mold making that I'll never forget. As soon as our little mountain is thoroughly saturated, there it is. There's no extra liquid there. Now Mrs. Hand said, do not stir your plaster. Just agitate it to avoid creating bubbles. You want to get the bubbles out. See the little bubbles coming up? Now we're ready to pour it into the mold. Now the best way, again, to prevent bubbles is to vibrate the mold slightly, because here in this side, the chin comes out and there's a place where air catches. So we have to tip the mold, and you may see the bubble come popping out as I vibrate it. But it'll come out, and that means the air is out from under that chin area, and you'll see if we've done our casting properly, there's no hole under the chin. Apparently the bubble is out because it hasn't appeared. So now we make our adjustment on the armature so it's in the center. And now we let this sit for about a half an hour. Well, now we're ready to remove our casting from the mold. I've taken off the alligator clips and I'm removing the rubber band that holds the mold together, taking the jacket away from the silicone, and now I'm going to split away the silicone from the casting. That's the back. The back is off. Now we're going to ease the face away, prying up a little bit on the armature. There, feels loose. And here comes the casting. There was no bubble, the chin came out nice and sharp. Place the skull in a vise with padding, very tight, because we're going to cut the back of the skull off with this saw, and you'll see why in a moment. Alright, now we have the back piece that fits the skull, and we'll remove the whole thing from the vise. Now we're ready to hollow out the skull, because these skulls have to be hollowed out to finish the job. We have to drill out the inside of the skull and hollow it out. And the first step in this is to drill through the eyes. This is a Fordham drill with a stone bit. We're going to drill straight through the eyes to the back. That's one side through. Other side through. Yeah. How they come out the other side isn't as important as they do come out the other side. Now we can begin to drill alongside those holes on a slant. Because we have to take out a lot of material in here. The trick is not to go through the skull, so that should be apparent to everybody watching. We're trying to make a cavity large enough to put a different kind of a bit in there. It will make more cut than this will. Now we're going to change our bit. This is really called a burr, and it will drill a lot of material out that the stone bit won't. Slowly insert it. Into our existing cut. We're only about a third of the way through it. And so far we've missed the armature. You don't see any armature in there showing yet. It may eventually show, but that's not critical. The critical thing is that we get behind the eye sockets so that eventually we can insert the eyeballs from the back. This is what this is all about. Now we've done about as much as it's safe to do with the burr, this big heavy burr. All right, now we have a different kind of a burr, a small burr. This is about the size of the eyeball that we're going to insert eventually. It's a little larger because we want some space around it. And we're going to drill further through the skull toward the opening here. See, these openings are very critical. We don't want to destroy these by drilling in from the front, but we want to get some space out from behind. So we're going to see how far we have to go. You literally have to look at the front and watch the progress. I don't know if you can see this coming forward in the skull as I'm drilling. But it should be obvious now that the burr is coming quite forward. It will begin to protrude, but it's not protruding and destroying the bone structure, it's just coming in from the back. Now we do the other side. And that's almost as much as we want to do until we have finished the sculpture and are ready to set the eyeballs in. Then we may want to tailor that a little more so that the eyeballs come forward as much as they are needed to do. And you notice on the inside we haven't interrupted the armature. This is still intact all the way around. And we should have enough space there to put the glass eyes in when the time comes. You will eventually see those eyes and how we put it in. The idea of making a chest or a breastplate around one of these skulls means that you have to attach some adjunct armature down here to hold the clay firmly against the neck and attach it to the skull so it will fit over the body. To do that, I build, and I am building for you, a frame here, which I will braze together, and then we will insert into the bottom of the neck and make a net to hold the clay. I'm going to use my Fordham drill to drill holes for the two armature rods to go in there next to the armatures that are already there. And now we're going to braze the frame that I'm building together to insert in that. So we're going to braze this same wire we used to make the armature in the skull. We're just going to braze this together here. Okay. Now you want to be careful because these alligator clips are hot now. They've been in the fire too. Take your alligator clips off and free our braze of the, if we can get it off. Off. There we go. There we go. If we had our squelching bottle, we could quench it, but we don't, so we're just going to let it cool. Now this is the major frame that we'll make a net in, or over. And we're going to insert these into the bottom of the neck. We have the holes already drilled in the neck, and we're going to insert these in those holes. And that will bring this down. So now we're going to make a net of fine galvanized wire over this to hold the clay itself. Now ordinarily I would put epoxy glue in those holes or to hold it very firmly, but any cement that is your favorite it will probably do. So those are glued in place. And another thing that I would suggest is in order to hold this head on the body, you're doing it over the shoulders and front and back. The shoulders fit up in there, the soft body. It would be my suggestion, instead of trying to make these hook into the body frame, which is at the top of the body structure, it's very hard to do when you're putting something down on top. You can't see what you're doing or get at it because the body surrounds it, is to make a permanent loop out of these. In other words, close them, braze them closed, and then run a wire or cable or a piece of this down through the body into the crotch and put a bead there and pull it down. That pulls it down into the body itself. The soft body is going to yield, give way, and accommodate it. So I'm going to braze that in one little point before we go further. Where's this thing? There it is. Simple as simple. Now we have a permanent loop at the bottom there to cable through the whole figure down to the crotch. This is a very lightweight galvanized wire, very fine, not quite hair-like, but it's very soft, very fine. And we're going to work it around the frame that we've made here and see if we can't make some sort of a braid across the area. The whole idea is to make some kind of a structure to hang the clay on. Now, if you were making a ceramic piece, you'd cast this all in one piece, but it wouldn't be as strong as this. It might be simpler if you have the right molds to do it. Because it's so soft, it's easily flexed and twisted around and doesn't break from all the twisting and the turning. We've got this rough frame or network across the frame of the shoulder plate, and we can put our clay on this. We'll put a reasonably heavy coating of clay. Now it's time to talk about clay. There are a great many varieties of paper clay on the market, I'm sure. But there are three that I'm familiar with. They're all made in Japan, or originate in their design in Japan. And the hardest and toughest is called diamond. I seldom use it except for something I want to reinforce, and that's what we're going to use to build out our breastplate. But diamond is hard to model and to do fine detail with, but it's strong as strong. The paper clay, called creative paper clay here, is in the middle of the three and is very easy to use. They all are built on the premise of a very fine clay powder and a cloth rag fiber to hold them together, and then some sort of a binder. I don't know the chemistry of it. It's just wonderful stuff to work with. But this creative paper clay, so-called, is the easiest to work with, to model. It's very light, and you can sand and cut and grind and receives the paint and the dyes and colors all very easily. Then is Ladal, sorry about the used parcel, again a Japanese product, but it's a very fine, very delicate clay, very fine rag is mixed into it, you can hardly tell. It's very weak, it doesn't have any strength to it at all, but it's good for finishing the final surface before you put any kind of a paint or a varnish or any kind of a finish of that nature over your completed project. So, and I seldom use it except for that, filling out scratches or something of that nature. I'm going to take some of this diamond paper clay and start a loose structure over our framework. See how tough it is. It's really tough. And it tends to do particularizing, and it's hard to work with, but it's really strong. And I'm going to use some of this kind of glue. Put a little of that on the frame, just for the sake of security. And then push the clay over the frame as fine as I can without the frame always showing through. But the thing about, as I've said about paper clay, is it's easily cut and ground away. If you have too much material, you can use your drill with some sort of a grinding bit and carry it off. You can also do it with sandpaper by hand. I'm happier using tools rather than my fingers to work with, but of course there are some occasions where the fingers do come in handy, and tools sometimes get in the way. I don't know of any tool that will pinch the way fingers pinch. You need a little more on the back here. A little more glue down around the edge of our joint of the neck. Even though this is a skull for a man, and the chest plate ordinarily would be for a female figure because they are more generally revealed in that area. This would work for a man whose shirt was partially open or had a loose collar or something like that. Additional nice thing about paper clay is that it is to a degree water soluble, even when dry, and you can oven dry it. You can't put it in a kiln because it has cloth or wood fibers in it, but you can oven dry it at a reasonably high heat, 250 or something, and then if you had to submerge it in water, I don't know why you would, but if you did, it would eventually dissolve. Now, that has pluses and minuses. With ceramic, porcelain, of course, it never dissolves, no matter what you do in water or chemicals. But paper clay is, in that respect, not as permanent as bronze or ceramic. But with bronze, the details are harder to come by, and with ceramic, it's breakable, very breakable. This, once it's dry, and you drop it on the floor, isn't going to shatter. If you want to make a slight declivity in the front, you can. Men and women both do have a declivity. But this is generally the way I would make a breast or chest plate. Now, it's hard to grind out the inside because we have the wires coming very close to the surface. But the outside, you have areas where you can smooth and grind even with a file, a wood file or sandpaper, or a grinding tool, and get better definition. The main thing is to get it shaped generally the way you want it and thoroughly dry. Once it's thoroughly dry, you can do a lot with it. You cannot grind it until it is dry. I've been asked to demonstrate how I employ the prosthetic teeth that I've had made for me. And we're going to substitute the prosthetic teeth for the cast plaster teeth on the skull. Here are the prosthetic teeth. They're made of a very, very powerful plastic used in the making of artificial teeth for full-scale people. There's an upper and a lower set of dentures. Now, how do we put these into the plaster skull? We're going to cut away the plaster to virtually the same amount of space that is taken up by these plastic teeth. And that's done with a saw. So we need to judge how far into the skull to cut. This is a jeweler saw that I'm using. Now we have to cut below the second set of teeth and into the jaw. The jaw may break off, very brittle at this point, but we're going to try and see if we can cut down into it before it does break off. So the clay teeth have been cut out of the jaw. We'll clear the passage here, so see if our set of teeth will slip in there in any way, shape, or form. Hard to see through my hand, but I can only use my fingers. I'm going to have to file down or cut down the bulk of some of this to make them fit. Because it's difficult to fit without something to set it in that's soft, I'm going to use a bit of paper clay and set it down in there just to help stabilize these sets of teeth. They're not glued in, they're just stabilized. And they're going to press, I'm pressing down the upper teeth into that clay. Now we're going to try well, the bottom is still too big, so I'm going to grind off a little bit of the bottom. After all, it's generally the front of the teeth you want to show, so what happens in the back, you don't want to show a yawning mouth, at least I would hope you wouldn't. And getting closer. A slight overbite, all to be repaired in time. I'm going to grind off a little more on the lowers. The main thing is to try to get them into a position that's normal looking and cement them in place. Then you model over it. This is one way to do it if you're directly modeling and not making a press mold of the skin. You're just modeling your face over this skull. I'm presuming this is what you're going to do anyway. If somebody wanted the mouth open, not just closed, showing teeth, but open, you have to cut the jaw free from the skull. And I've done that with this particular model. The hinge is simply temporary, so it won't fall apart while I'm demonstrating it. But if you wanted to do this, what I do in those very rare occasions when I want an open mouth with teeth showing is that I do everything we've talked about. Press mold and everything. The clay is over the face, the teeth are under the clay, just like we've discussed. And then, when I take it out of the press mold, I begin to move the teeth apart, pry them apart, pushing the jaw down. Once the jaw is cut this way, you can move it up and down inside the clay. Now, the clay isn't rubber, so it will begin to pull apart a bit on the cheeks. But this is something you have to resculpt. There's no other way that I know of to do this. Or if you're doing it directly over the skull, not in a press mold, then you can open the jaw wherever you want it, set it there, glue it in place, and begin modeling over it. Generally, you don't show much teeth when you open the mouth, generally. Now, there are always exceptions to everything. And we only have one example in the collection of a mouth slightly open and a bit of teeth showing, and this is the image of Prince Potemkin. He's singing. You see how I've cut the jaw right free from the skull. You have to have some space below. You have to figure this out yourself, but you can see how it works. It's very rare that a jaw is this far open in any kind of a sculpture, no matter how you open it. There, we'll give you an example of how I would do it.